Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 89. Are you ready to break open the first days of puzzles from the annual Advent of Code challenge? Advent of Code is an advent calendar of 25 programming puzzles published each December. Practicing solving puzzles is a great way to build your Python skills. This week on the show, we have previous guest and Real Python author, Geir Arne Hjelle, to discuss his recent article titled Advent of Code, Solving Your Puzzles with Python. We discuss the history of this online advent calendar and the creator, Eric Wastl. Geir Arne covers techniques to help you organize your code and test when solving the puzzles. He shares additional Python tools for parsing text, managing puzzle data, and visualizing your program output. We also talk about even more places you can practice solving programming puzzles. This episode is brought to you by CData software, the easiest way to connect Python with data, SQL access to more than 250 cloud applications and data sources. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Geir Arne, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much. Great to be back. Always fun to talk.
Yeah, definitely. We're making this sort of a tradition here.
Yeah, we have a great topic for today as well. So,
oh yeah, I'm excited about that. To kind of, I guess, to kick off is you also have kind of a bit of a new role at Real Python, being a little more involved than before.
Yes.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about what you're doing with the team now.
Yes. So up until now, I've mainly been just freelancing on Real Python in my spare time. But starting from, yesterday when we're recording this, I've started working full-time with Real Python. So now I'll have much more time to dive into topics, create tutorials, and essentially just work with the team on figuring out what we can do that would be useful for our readers, listeners, viewers, and so on.
Yeah, great. I'm excited about it. I'm excited to
Me too.
Spend more time and potentially have even more conversations. So that's great.
Yes, I'm really excited myself.
So you had an article come out last week also. This will be coming out Friday from now about Advent of Code.
Yep.
And maybe we can kind of start with talking about that project. There was also an interview with the creator, and I'm hoping pronouncing his last name correctly, but Eric Wastl, I think is how you pronounce it.
I think that's correct, yeah.
And that came out just the week before by Ricky.
Yep.
Ricky and I had talked about it in an earlier show. But yeah, what is the Advent of Code?
Right. So Advent of Code is an advent calendar. So essentially these things where you typically open a door every day in the month of Christmas until Christmas, either Christmas Day or Christmas Eve, I guess. And when I grew up, we kind of had them, and I got one piece of chocolate every day. And my parents made one with a small presents. They tended to be Lego or something like this. Nowadays, I think you can kind of find commercial advent calendars with all kinds of things.
Yeah, the one I see all the time is one for my pets.
Right, okay, yeah.
Give them a treat or a toy every day. So
That's nice, yeah. No, I've had the last couple of years for myself. I have a tea calendar, so I get
there you go.
a new tea every day. So
yeah.
It's really nice. Advent of Code kind of takes this idea and turns it into a coding challenge, essentially. So you get a coding puzzle every day for the days of December. I believe it was started in 2015, so this would be, the 7th year it's running?
Wow, yeah, okay.
By Eric Wastl, and he has a great presentation online where he kind of talks a little bit about behind the scenes of Advent of Code and how it kind of got started as this small, almost like the joke kind of project that he was just working on for some friends of his.
Yeah.
Talks about how he probably did the worst traffic estimation ever in guessing that, maybe there will be like 50 people that are interested in doing something like this. And even before the first day, I think only through word of mouth, he had much more than 50 people having joined.
Yeah.
I think for the first year, at least, there was in the tens of thousands of people joining already in 2015.
Wow.
So
yeah, that's a big surprise.
Yeah, so they had a busy December in 2015, I think, and then, but it's an amazing project. I'm so amazed at what they've been able to do, both in terms of kind of the platform of it, but also the puzzles are so much fun to work on. So for myself, I actually don't remember how I discovered it, but I have dug through my files and realized that the first puzzle I did was in December 2016.
Okay, second year. Okay.
So on the second year, I think, it took a few days into December, so I think it was like December 3rd or 4th or something that I found this, probably through Twitter or Reddit or something like this. And I think the first puzzle I did was I then actually went back to day one of that, which is helping Santa essentially navigate. So you kind of get this right-left instruction, so you kind of need to navigate somewhere on the North Pole and looking for the evil Easter Bunny or something like that.
It's always a fun story. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the cool features, right? There's this really completely ridiculous story typically about how Santa needs your help to save Christmas.
Right.
It always turns out that you need to find 50 stars in order to save Christmas. So that's sort of like something that happens every year. And these stars you gain by solving the puzzles. So there's 25 days, and then each day there is sort of like a 2-part puzzle. So you get 2 stars every day. And then ideally then you'll fill up and manage to find these 50 stars so you can save Christmas. But the nice thing with this is that even though it kind of has this built-in time pressure in a sense, and it's kind of, especially when it's running into the holiday season, you kind of tend to be busy with other things.
Yeah.
All the old puzzles are always available. So even if there's a day that you don't have time to get to, you can always go back and redo them later.
Yeah, that's my history with it. I found after people had been talking about it for a while, and I was looking for ways to sort of practice, and I always have been into puzzles, and that's like one of my favorite areas of video games, and so when it came to learning a new language, I think I was dabbling with like JavaScript or something like that, and that's probably the first time I had heard about it, and so I kind of found the old ones, and then when I got into Python, I guess 4 years ago, somebody said, "Oh, you should check these out," and so it's a neat way to kind of translate your skills across. And
yeah,
I don't know. I think it's great that he keeps all of them live. That you can still go back and check them out.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I'm actually, one of my favorite things as well is use these puzzles to actually practice something particular. But last year I was using them to practice Julia, this data science language.
Oh, yeah.
And that was a lot of fun. And essentially I ended up, the first couple of days, I was first doing the puzzle in Python and then kind of just translating it into Julia.
Okay.
But then as I got more and more familiar with Julia, I was able to, I think, both write Julia instead of Python in Julia, which helps, and start doing the puzzles in Julia first, which was sort of like a proud moment when I was, okay, I managed to do it today to actually do the Julia first.
I wonder if that's a common thing, people trying to translate their skills across in other languages and having, like a set task to do it with. So kind of being able to compare it, because usually, like I remember when I would read sample code of something that was like JavaScript, and then like kind of in my brain, like, okay, how would I convert this into Python? Wasn't too far abstracted. They're pretty similar. Something like R, where I'm not sure how Julia looks. R looks very different. Like it has some really kind of unique structures and syntax, before you start adding libraries. So what has been your experience as far as like comparing different languages using something like this?
I've had a lot of fun with it. And I think, of course, there's this old saying, you can write Fortran in any language. You kind of, whatever language you're most used to write, you kind of tend to take those mannerisms from that language and try to pry them into whatever new language you want to try them. So the challenge to yourself a little bit is to try to actually write in that language properly, right? And not just do the word-for-word translation. But that takes some time, and that's another place where I really like the advent of code puzzles, because they are fairly small and self-contained, so you can kind of create something that works, and then you can kind of work through it and come up with ways to kind of make it more fluent for that language and things like this. And there's also this huge community around advent of code, so even for weird languages, you'll be able to find other people who have solved it in that language who might have more experience than you. And so like Julia, which is, I guess, an up-and-coming language, I found quite a lot of people who had solved advent of code in Julia, so I would kind of go and look at their solutions after I did them myself and learn a lot about the language that way.
Yeah, you learn the idioms or what have you that are kind of like start to make sense. The really interesting use of for loops in Python, not requiring increments and things like that you can kind of use iterables and tools like enumerate, which I remember John Fincher getting super excited about last year in Advent of Code. He's like, oh my gosh, I really was excited to use this because we had like a real Python article that came out at the same time.
Right.
Kind of giving you that nice count as you use it. And that was something I used to solve some of the first puzzles of this one, just as something that kind of came up in my mind. I'm like, oh, I could solve it this way. In your article, you kind of go into not only the history, you dive into something I do want to talk about more, which if people are interested in where are other puzzles they could find and practice this stuff. But you had this neat quote from I guess it's Joe Armstrong.
Yeah.
And the quote is, make it work, then make it beautiful. Then you really, really if you have to, really, really have to make it fast.
Right.
90% of the time, if you make it beautiful, it will already be fast. So really just make it beautiful. And I really agree with that. Like if it flows and it makes sense, and especially problems like this, they're not computationally intense. You could see ways you could do more with it, but with a modern computer running the examples, at least that most of the ones that I've seen, it's really, I guess you could test it and do further. Is that something you do? Like, have you gone into the whole like optimization things? For me, I really just want to solve it and then maybe think about like structurally, how to prettify it,
Yeah. So there's been a couple of problems, not that many that can be computationally heavy.
Oh, okay.
If you use kind of the wrong algorithm, so if you kind of just try to brute force your way through it, it won't work. But then, so there's some of those where you kind of would need to work up a better algorithm, essentially. So there's been a few of them, but usually they tend to be late in the calendars as kind of the difficulty increases.
Yeah. Okay.
I remember I was struggling with was day 18 of 2019, so 2 years ago. Yeah, I was struggling quite heavily with that, and I think I may not still haven't solved the second part of it. So, but I have seen people solving it with less than half a second of running time, so it is something that should be doable.
Okay.
So, but yeah, what I tend to do a little bit, I have gone back and reworked some solutions when I kind of either have gotten a new idea for something or just want to try something out. I remember there was a cool puzzle last year that essentially asked you to redefine the rules of mathematics in terms of precedence. So usually you want to do multiplication first and then addition, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay.
This somehow there was again some weird backstory about how they had invented a new kind of math where you needed to do addition first and then multiplication. Usually
it's the elves that are screwing this all up, right?
Yeah. There was something there again. And then, of course, the intuitive way to do this would then just be to parse everything yourself and then make sure that you do the addition first and then multiplication later. And I first solved it like that, but then I kind of realized that, well, with Python, you can also just kind of re-implement the operations. So re-implement plus and multiplication for your own numbers. So I kind of just then did a solution where I essentially took my own numbers and then flipped around multiplication and addition so that I could use the natural precedence rules of Python for those operators. And it was a fun exercise then in just playing with the object-oriented parts of Python and figuring out how that worked. And since this was in the smaller setting of the puzzle, I could do a lot of testing on it, and I learned several of the pitfalls that it wasn't as straightforward as I'd hoped, but it was still fairly doable, and it kind of turned out to be a neat solution to the whole thing. So
yeah, that sounds, so you were like re-implementing special methods for add and
exactly. So
multiply and things like that. Okay.
Yeah, so if you create your own class, right, you can implement, if you want to implement plus for instances of your class, you just implement the _add method on it. So essentially what I did was I had my own integers, but whenever you try to do an add, it would multiply, and whenever you try to do a multiply, it would add. And then if you just wrote out with the math with those new numbers, it would kind of do this weird math that was in the puzzle.
Okay. We'd do it. Okay. Because there is a precedent order that Python has.
Right.
And so you were sort of, okay. You're modifying what they did so that you could have it use this new precedence that had been set. Puzzle.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fun.
So essentially do so whenever it's a multiplication sign, it would do plus, because that goes before the plus sign, it would multiply, which goes last. And so it's been a few of those where I've been able to kind of do some weird solutions and then just try things out.
CData software. Connect, integrate, and automate your data from Python or any other application or tool. At CData, we simplify connectivity between all of the applications and data sources that power business, making it easier to unlock the value of data. Our SQL-based connectors streamline data access, making it easy to access real-time data from on-premise or cloud databases, SaaS, APIs, NoSQL, and big data. Check out CData.com to learn more. I liked the article, how a lot of people might write this as a script. A lot of people think of Python as like a scripting language. I'm just like, come up with this straightforward, like, do this in order and so forth. And one of the things that you stress, I think, in the article, you kind of stress is like, well, if you want to make this sort of repeatable, if you want it to be able to be testable, to run there's always sort of a test case that he provides and an answer for, in that maybe you should actually be building these as functions, and then you can be reusing the test data versus the actual problem data in there, which I think is really smart. And then you had a couple other kinds of things that you're adding. So what's your idea behind that, sort of templatizing some of these things?
Right. And it does definitely depend on what you kind of want out of Advent of Code. And I think the answer to that is almost, it depends on you, and it's different between everyone. And I think just to make sure it's spelled out, you can definitely just write the simple scripts, and Advent of Code is just great for especially the early problems. Often can just solve them in the REPL, even just interactively playing with stuff.
Yeah.
So I think that's great. But as you kind of get more into it, you can also use it to practice different things. And one of those would be how to set up testing, how to do unit testing in particular. So if you want to do that, then it's nice to have functions that you can test. And once you kind of get a little bit into Advent of Code and get used to the question, you'll see that there is a very set structure to the whole thing that will kind of be repeated every day. So you kind of need to parse the puzzle input somehow. You need to solve part 1, you need to solve part 2, and it all comes from the same input and so on. So you can just set up a template that kind of takes care of, for instance, reading in the input. That you can always do that the same way, and then the parsing might be slightly different, but it's quite often it's some kind of list of numbers or some kind of list of symbols. So you can kind of set up a few different parsing functions like that, and then be prepared for the puzzle solving part, which is much more varied.
Had you primarily done it with like just sort of copying? One of the things I guess we could maybe note is that even if somebody was to share their their solution as they log into this thing. The data that is provided to them beyond the example data that's stated in the problem statement is going to be unique per user.
Yeah.
And so you can't just simply plug in your, session, if you will, as you go to Advent of Code, their answer. It would come up wrong because it would be your unique data, which I think is really clever. I know of other puzzle sites where that's not really the case. It's not kind of thought of that way.
Right.
But that does make it kind of funky in the sense that you have to get this data.
Yeah.
And getting the data, as you click on a page, it's just like, it's like a text stream of stuff. And so you could save that as a text file. I don't know. What were your techniques that you went through? Because there is a new way that I found through your article that I was like, oh, that's intriguing, but
right.
kind of has its own difficulties to it, as far as the way you parse it compared to like what you would parse out of a text file.
Right. So so originally I would just essentially click on the link on the webpage and copy paste, usually from the input data that was then shown to me. I think, possibly in the beginning, I would then paste it directly into my code, but quite soon I figured it's nice to paste it into a separate text file because then it's easier to just say, I want to run my solution against this input, or I want to run it against the example data and things like this. It's easy to switch them around if I just have them in a couple of different text files. But there were actually a couple of days when I was kind of told I had the wrong answer and I couldn't figure out the problem. And at some point I realized that the copy-paste buffer on my computer wasn't big enough to copy-paste the data.
Oh, wow.
So I was kind of only getting parts of the input. So then...
gosh, where would it max out at?
I don't know if it's maybe a megabyte or something like this. I don't know.
Interesting. All right, okay. Huh.
So, and I have heard from others, I think even Eric Wastl himself mentioned at some point that is one of the most common mistakes that kind of trips people up, is that didn't get all the input data, essentially. So there are tools that people have developed, and by now I think there are quite many of them, different kind of sort of like command line tools for Advent of Code. But the one that I use in the tutorial is one called Advent of Code Data, I guess.
Yeah, all hyphens in between the words. Yeah,
exactly. And it comes with a small command line tool that's called AOCD, so Advent of Code Data. Its easiest function, at least, is that you can just say AOCD and then say 2021-10 or something, and then that will download the day 10 of 2021, and you kind of just get your input data directly. So you can either store them to a text file, or you could even call this package directly from your code and just read it directly from the website when you run it.
Yeah, it's nice. You can, for Python wise, you can just pip install it, which is kind of nice.
Exactly. And this particular tool also has the possibility that you can submit your answers directly from the tool even. So you could kind of automate the whole thing.
Oh, I didn't find that part yet.
Into it. Yeah, I'm not sure I actually mentioned it in the tutorial, come to think of it. Yeah, it has several of these more advanced features as well. And you can get a look at your history of your previous solutions if you kind of keep trying things and they're not working and things like this.
It takes a little bit of work to either set up an environment variable with, again, your personal cookie data for it. And you have links for it in the article. Definitely look for that if you're interested in using this tool. And then even, when you go to use it, it'll sort of warn you, which is good.
Yeah.
But that took a minute for me.
Exactly. Yeah. It's fairly easy to use once you set it up. And the magic to setting it up is that you need to have your unique identifier so that it knows it's you. And this unique identifier isn't very easily accessible. So essentially what you end up doing is just go into your these developer things in the web browsers and then look for the cookie that is set on that web page.
Yeah, when I went into that in Safari, it was a little weird because it had everything else with it. I had to get rid of all the other information about it and strip it down just to the raw string of the cookie. So, yeah.
Exactly. But once you've done it once, then it should be okay. And
you had a whole bunch of other kind of cool suggestions in the article of things that you might not be thinking of. Python is fantastic in the sense that it has all these built-in tools as part of it, the whole sort of batteries included mentality of Python. But sometimes you're going to want to maybe use some additional things. And so maybe we could talk about some of those additional packages that might come in handy.
Yes. So there's, I think, every year there'll be a couple of problems that takes a little bit of extra text parsing. I think you can usually always get away with sort of like doing some splits and then some slicing and things like this with strings that are often easier to do if you know a little bit of this regular expressions kind of mini language, where you can kind of specify that, okay, I need this to be 3 strings interspersed with some numbers there, and then pick out the space that's there and so on. I guess regular expressions are famous for being fairly complicated to especially read afterwards. I think they're almost easier to write than to understand after you've written them.
That's funny.
And they're not that easy to write either, especially if you haven't been exposed to them. What I tend to use and kind of works, I think, in 99% of the regular expression cases is a neat little library called parse. And what it does is that it kind of just reverses the f-string syntax. So when we want to use f-strings for printing something, right, we just put the variables within curly braces, and then it interpolates the variables into it.
Yeah.
So what parse does is that you can kind of then add a template string where there's things that you want to capture, you add the curly braces and then give them a name inside of there. So it looks really like an f-string, but it's then parsed in reverse so that you can then essentially pick out. So this first word, for instance, should be an ID, and then there comes age maybe, and then a color afterwards. And I kind of just make the template string for this and then use parse. And what parse actually does in the background is to build this regular expression for you, but you don't really need to care about that. You don't need to look at the regular expression. You can just see this nice little pattern.
Or be confused by it later.
Right. Although, if you really want to learn a little bit more about regular expressions, you can definitely just pop it up and have a look at it and compare it with the pattern. So I really enjoy the parse library for those kind of problems. I think that's a really neat one.
It seems to be a pretty common area of the problems that come across is some, text sort of wrangling.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like that there is data wrangling to this. That's a conversation we've had a few times with Kyle Stratus.
Yeah.
This whole idea of like so much of information that's provided is so clean often and ready to go, and it's like all nice and neat, and it's like, no, actually that can be 50% or more of the problem solving is just like getting it into like something where you can actually do more of your problem solving on it, which I think is, I like tackling those types of problems. I think that's a fun part of the puzzle.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think one thing that in the template that I kind of offer in the article, I have kind of split out the parsing step as its own separate step. And often it is just, okay, convert this list or this string into a list of numbers or something like this. But sometimes you can do quite a lot of the parsing earlier to kind of make the problem easier to solve later. And I think that's always a fun challenge to see how can I actually prepare this data for something that's useful to work with later.
Yeah. We already kind of mentioned the idea of adding tests and unit test, but you said explicitly maybe you want to break it into something a little more advanced, like PyTest. Is that something that you do?
Yes, I have been using PyTest quite actively, and it's kind of nice to just be running on this smaller test set, both because it's faster, but often because you can manually just check that things are okay. And then when PyTest then lights up all green for me and says that I've solved it for the example problems, I'm usually fairly confident that I also solved it for the big input. Although sometimes there's some surprises there, but it's usually quite ready then. And so I tend to use it quite a lot.
Okay.
I've now tested it this year. I've started being a little bit more conscious of trying to run some doc tests as well. So essentially the small examples that you just write into the doc strings, and PyTest can run on those as well. So they're kind of nicely integrated, and it's a great way of just debugging and seeing what works and what don't work.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you mentioned NumPy.
Yeah.
A lot of people think of pandas, but just NumPy by itself can be really handy.
Yeah, I think for these kind of puzzles, usually NumPy, plain NumPy is more easier to work with often, especially that there's usually some problems every year that involve some kind of grid. And then your NumPy kind of data structures are great for doing the grids, both because you can easily address different parts of the grid, and it's typically really fast, so you can kind of get away with doing stuff that might be too slow to do with lists of lists and things like this.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about, those kind of structures, yeah.
Right. So I think last year we did quite a lot, actually. I think there were like 3, maybe even 4 problems that involved cellular automata, so this game of life kind of thing, where you have this almost looks like living creatures that can kind of evolve on a grid. And I believe the reason for this was that John Conway, who was kind of recognized as the inventor of Game of Life, died in 2020. So it was kind of in honor of him. There were several of the Game of Life problems last year, and for those kind of things, NumPy is really nice.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another RealPython video course. It covers a topic we touch on during this week's episode, and I think will come in handy in your pursuit of better solutions. It's titled Regular Expressions and Building Regexes in Python. The course is based on a pair of articles by John Sturtz, and in the course, previous guest Christopher Trudeau takes you through practicing the fundamentals of building regular expressions, like matching meta characters, regex anchors and quantifiers, and how grouping works. Then you'll learn how to implement all of those skills in Python using the RE module, accessing the groups you've found, how to substitute, split, and escape, how to create flags, and several advanced matching techniques. I think learning how to harness the power of regular expressions is a worthy investment of your time. String matching like this is a common task in programming. You can get a lot done with string operators and built-in methods, but at times, you'll need these more sophisticated pattern matching capabilities. And like most of the video courses on RealPython, the course is broken into easily consumable sections. You get code examples for techniques shown, and all courses have a transcript including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com. So we had Will McGugan on the show, and we talked about Rich and, the kind of the TUI kind of thing. But one of the tools that you mentioned, is in that kind of vein of making the terminal and output, like kind of prettifying it somewhat, of Colorama. How are you using that?
Yes, so Colorama seems to be complementing Rich in a sense, and you can use Colorama to just place the cursor in the terminal. I haven't found something in Rich that can do the same, but that means that I can draw these grids, for instance, from NumPy in the terminal.
Okay.
And use that to debug stuff. So I can kind of, maybe there's a maze that needs some solving, and I'm kind of trying to figure out why am I not being able to solve the maze. And then you can use Colorama to actually just draw it directly in the terminal. So it's a fairly straightforward and easy way to just visualize things.
Yeah, I can imagine that there are going to be these circumstances where it may help you a lot just to be able to kind of see, like this year, you're doing a bunch of stuff in a submarine. And so there's like these sort of navigational clues that are happening in some of the puzzles. And so I could imagine having something that might be able to visualize that. Even if it's just sort of simplified, via text, could be handy. So I could see some of those libraries like Rich or Colorama kind of being handy. I'm just sort of thinking of like those are directions that the set of puzzles is going to go. So
right, yeah, and that is actually one of the fun things. So the biggest community around Advent of Code lives on Reddit. So there's a subreddit called Advent of Code.
Okay.
And one of the things that pops up there all the time are people just visualizing things I didn't even realize you could visualize in all kind of fantastic manners. So
oh, cool.
It's great to just surf around there and look at some of the amazing creations that people have been making in terms of visualizing different things.
Yeah, and one thing that we're doing is having, I guess it's a pretty common thing to have like a shared leaderboard of people that are going through the challenges. And I'm not even positive how that works. I haven't explored it yet.
Right. Yeah. So Advent of Code comes with the leaderboard. And I guess this goes back a little bit to the underestimation of the popularity of the platform.
Okay, yeah.
Because since the beginning, I think the leaderboard has been the fastest 100 people to solve the puzzle gets on the leaderboard for the day.
Oh, yeah, a mere 100.
Exactly, and that has kind of stayed constant for the 7 or at least the 6 years I've participated. And I think by now, especially on the first puzzles of the year, the leaderboard fills up in a few minutes.
Wow.
So essentially, please just ignore the leaderboard in a sense. That there's the people who are able to get on the leaderboard are just fantastic coders that are highly prepared to do this and kind of practice how to do it and so on.
Because it's timing wise based on a release time that, depending where you are in the world, is going to be advantageous or disadvantageous,
right?
And isn't necessarily so. Like having your own one might be make more sense, or even people that are within your own little group.
Yeah.
So like we're trying to do one on our Slack, I think, right?
Yes, exactly. So in addition to the global leaderboard, which you should ignore, what you definitely should try out are the private leaderboards. And as you say, these are things where you essentially everyone. Once you log in, you have your own private leaderboard, and then you can kind of choose to share that with others. And then people can join that private leaderboard. So as you said, at Real Python, we have set up a private leaderboard then for members of the community. And I think, we have a fair amount of people joining that one. And then we have a discussion on our Slack forums after the puzzle every day, and how did people solve it, and kind of share some tips and tricks and laugh about the silly story and things like this. So that's I think a much better way to enjoy the Advent of Code together with people than striving for the global leaderboard.
Yeah. Our whole point is, like this is a learning experience, right? So
yeah,
and trying to get a little bit more out of it. And
exactly. And this year we've been several who've kind of been thinking about, okay, Python 3.10 recently came out with the structural pattern matching. So that's also something that's really nice to try out for several of these problems where you do this data wrangling, right? And that's a little bit what the structural pattern matching is really good at. So that's also something that's been a lot of fun to just try out and then share some experiences afterwards.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's cool. One other kind of just talking internally, Real Python, community thing is we have office hours for members also. And you were able to join a recent one there and talk about it. And you said you had kind of some interesting experiences there, kind of dabbling around.
Right. Yeah. So we did an office hour on December 1st, just when the first puzzle launched, and kind of just made sure that people were aware of Advent of Code. I was doing a demo, kind of showing a little bit how to work with it. We decided that we didn't do this year puzzle because we didn't want to spoil it for those who hadn't done it yet.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
So I picked up day 1 from 2018 and was working on that. And at some point there, I also managed to shoot myself really hard in the foot by trying to show an example of how a list is not the best thing to search through. If you just need to search through things, then if you're doing lookup, a set is much better. That kind of comes into play in that puzzle. And to just show this, I was going to create a big list and then show that it was slow to iterate through. And I managed to create such a big list that it apparently crashed my computer and the whole demo, which at least was a learning experience, probably for all of us.
Yeah.
So don't create large lists at home.
There are limitations.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I think a lot of people get out of it, and we've kind of hinted on this a lot, is that there is not only a history of this idea of puzzles in computer science and and in computer programming, and using it as a way to sort of practice your skills. And so there's like a whole sort of I don't know, a set of different websites and other resources, and you provided a handful there. And I was familiar with a couple, like I'm guessing it's pronounced Project Euler.
Right.
If I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, it's Euler. And that's the one that I had seen prior to advent of code. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that one, and then a couple of these other resources that you listed.
Right. Yeah, I think Project Euler must have been around a long time. I remember seeing it when I was at university as well, and it kind of started with some math puzzles, but I think it's kind of grown into being, still usually some math formulation around the puzzles, but this is, and I guess we haven't properly said this. So advent of code, you can solve in any language, and the same with Project Euler.
Right.
And the trick to doing this is that you don't actually submit your code, right? You just submit the answer to some problem. And so Project Euler in that sense is very similar to advent of code. Then once you kind of start solving the problems, you get, for Project Euler, you get access to sort of like a community thread where you can discuss your solutions. Advent of Code doesn't offer any kind of discussion platform directly on the site. It relies on places like Reddit for doing the discussion, or more private things like we have on the Real Python community, where we have a sort of like a private discussion about things. Then another site that I became aware of a couple of years ago when I was trying out some a very neat kind of language course from some place called Groxio. They used a platform there called Exorcism that they used for the practice problems.
I love that name. Like it. Yes. You think of like, okay, wait. Are we talking like we're going to remove demons or something like that? But it's actually more like exercises.
Exactly.
So there's no additional O in there.
No, but there's
so yeah.
There's it's closely the spelling is too close probably, but yeah, Exorcism is a fantastic site for learning different programming languages. So it kind of has these learning tracks, and there it is focused. You get a lot of these small programming puzzles, but they're all kind of focused for a language, and then you could get mentoring, or definitely can discuss with others within that language. It's great for actually kind of learning a new language and getting feedback on are you handling the idioms correctly and things like this.
Cool.
So I have been using that a little bit for just trying out some new languages as well.
You tried their Julia ones?
The Julia one, Elixir, has been something I've been dabbling in lately.
Okay.
Originally, I tried one called Crystal, which is essentially a compiled version of Ruby. So there's lots of fun stuff to just check out, I guess.
55 languages, wow.
Yeah. Then there's, I guess the two other ones I mentioned. There's one called Code Wars and another called HackerRank. And in Code Wars, again, based on small little puzzles, and there they have a built-in editor with testing and so on, so you kind of solve it directly in the browser. And again, there's a forum section to it, so you can kind of compare to other people, how they're doing it. And HackerRank is more focused on actually recruiting people, and if you're looking for a job.
Yeah.
So it kind of offers you some certifications, and also there's a job board where employers can kind of say that we're interested in people. Please solve these puzzles for us, so we can see your coding skills and things like this. So there's kind of things for all kinds of what you want to get out of it. There's another one we could probably link to. It's not in my tutorial, but we should link to it in the podcast notes, called Data Puzzles.
Okay.
Which is, I guess, more if you're interested in doing data science and then using data science to solve puzzles. So they had a couple of very interesting puzzles as well. It's they don't have a lot of puzzles, but the ones that are there are quite fun.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of an offshoot, is when there are platforms that try to make coding and solving problems into sort of gamification of that kind of concept. And the one that I dabbled after I heard this on conversation on teaching Python with the creators of Twilio Quest. And
right.
And Twilio is kind of an interesting platform where you're, able to create text messages and messaging and that sort of stuff. And so it's a way that, yes, you can create this free account, but what do you do with it? And so they do it through this very 8-bit style adventure game where you're still kind of solving problems. But as you set up things correctly in your environment and create your first API connections and calling to create these text messages and kind of connecting it. And then you can pick different languages, and they have a whole okay, if you want to implement it with Python, then you're kind of going down this whole avenue with Python versus JavaScript, which I thought was really clever. I guess there's one called Code Combat that is maybe like that too, which I haven't ever tried that. I think I mixed the names of Code Wars and Code Combat up at some point, but I know that Al Swigert wanted to, we were joking about creating something that wasn't involving like battling,
right?
That maybe we could make one that was based around like a farming simulator or something like that, where you're automating all the different tools and stuff. So but yeah, I mean, that's always been kind of a clever way to kind of get into programming, and definitely like just to have, if you find these things fun, there's a lot of really interesting ones that are out there in different platforms. The one that you mentioned, the one that's more sort of job based,
HackerRank.
Did you have you signed up for that? And because you're very much behind, like you got to go through their whole login procedures before you can really even see anything what it looks like.
Yeah, I've signed up and just played a little bit with it. I haven't used it for anything, say proper yet, but just get to know the platform a little bit. Then there's a couple of things that are really specialized to learning particular skills.
Okay.
So one fun one that I came across a couple of years ago is called Vim Adventures. So, the VI or Vim editor.
Yeah.
Which is this. I guess VI. It's one of the old classics on Unix. I guess originally back from the 70s, and it's extremely powerful, but also kind of has this huge learning curve. So there's essentially a site called Vim Adventures where you can learn Vim while playing a game. So it's essentially a dungeon crawl, but to move around, you actually need to type these Vim commands. So it kind of forces you to...
Yeah, that'd be a good way to get them, internalize them.
Exactly.
The way that like a spelling, or not spelling, but a typing tutor kind of game might get you to internalize some of the, get your fingers in the right places. Yeah, okay.
Exactly. And I also remember this one. It's a long time since I came across this one, but I think it's still around, called Command Line Murder Mystery. So...
That sounds amazing.
Maybe we should rename it but essentially it's a repo where there's just tons of information hidden in huge text files, and to be able to figure this out, you need to just try out different command line tools to so you learn things like grep, where you can search for a word inside of a document, and some cut, I guess, where you can cut out columns and things like this.
That sounds really amazing. I got to find that.
There's so much amazing things that people make.
Yeah.
So many cool resources out there.
Yeah. And, I think it's just, we mentioned the idea of like comparing different programming languages and taking your skills across, but just sort of, if you want to try out, like you just mentioned also the idea of, hey, there's these new things that are happening in these new versions of Python. Now that it's annual, it's becoming even more one of these things where maybe you're interested in seeing, well, what can we do with the walrus operator from a couple years ago?
Yeah.
Like maybe these aren't things that you're going to put in your day-to-day code, but you could see how they solve these problems, and it becomes much more internalized to what you're doing, which I think is, that's another great resource. Are there other reasons that you see people should be dabbling in these types of code puzzles?
Yeah, I know Eric Wastl himself kind of says that the most important reason to do it is because it's fun. You should just
right
have fun with it. It's kind of the biggest takeaway.
Yeah.
There's apparently also been people who have been using this for recruitment, so you can kind of show off your puzzle solving skills, sort of like as a for interested employers and things like this, that you can actually solve puzzles effectively. Apparently, there's it's been used in courses at the university.
Oh, okay.
Eric Wastl, again, in this talk that he has, which we're linking to, shows an example where the final exam of some course is solve Advent of Code day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in 2019. And it's kind of so that's the final exam to pass the course, and it's kind of all kind of weird things that people have been doing with it.
That's kind of relying on, the teacher didn't do their homework.
Yeah, I think it might not be the best version of what to do with it, but it pops up in all kind of weird places.
Yeah. And we should mention that you can donate to kind of keep this thing going also. And you mentioned that in the article, but I'll include links for that.
Yeah. So it is possible to donate some money, and then it's also great to just support it by getting the word out and helping people and supporting each other and things like this. So
yeah, totally. So, it's been a while since we've done this. I think the other couple of times we've been on, we had multiple guests, and so I don't think we went through this. But
right.
The first one is, what's something that you're excited about in the world of Python right now?
Yes. So if I'm being very personal, I'm very excited about having gone full time with real Python, and I think that will be a lot of fun to be able to dig even more into things on this side. I had a friend who just told me, you just turn your hobby into work. And I think that's definitely true. So now I might need a new hobby, but I will figure that one out. And then more broadly, I guess, I'm really excited to be able to try out the pattern matching features a little bit more. So lately, I have been playing around with Elixir. I think I briefly mentioned it earlier, which is a functional language that really has this structural pattern matching completely baked into the language, and it kind of opens up so many fun possibilities. So the Python version of this is a little bit, I guess it's a light version of what's done in several of these functional programming languages, but at the same time, I think it could open up many different avenues. So I'm really excited to just try them out and see what I'm able to do there.
Cool. And then this one doesn't have to be Python specific, but what's something that you want to learn next?
I guess I touched on it. Elixir. So this is a language that I mentioned. It's functional, and it runs on the Erlang platform, essentially. So this kind of is something that I got fascinated with a long time ago. So Erlang kind of comes from the Ericsson telecom company.
Oh, didn't know that.
And it's been used in telecom in the 80s and 90s. And it has this just completely crazy reliability and concurrency built into the platform, mainly through message passing. So all the little processes are just sort of like passing messages around. I was briefly looking at this quite a long time ago, but Erlang has this weird syntax that I never was able to really wrap my head around. And so then not too long ago, I want to say 2012 maybe or something, Elixir was created, which is then a much nicer syntax on top of the Ericsson platform or Erlang platform.
So in the ways that it being functional, the idea of sort of not changing
exactly
the state and stuff like that, that would help those kind of platforms a lot. That makes sense to me.
Yes, so it's Elixir is essentially immutable, and that kind of helps a lot with the concurrency, right? Because then you can kind of trust that, okay, this thing will never change. So you can just run off in many different processes with it.
Okay. And
I have been just keeping an eye on this for a long time, but then this spring, they launched something called NX, a numerical Elixir, where they somehow have added a numerical layer on top of Elixir. And that can do machine learning, data science, and those kind of things. And I haven't yet gotten myself to the level of understanding Elixir enough to be able to work with this.
To stack that on top of it.
Right. But that's what really got me excited, since I'm doing, or I kind of come from this data science background.
Yeah.
So that will be a lot of fun to look at. And actually, if to tie this back to Advent of Code, so Jose Valim, who is the creator of Elixir, so essentially the Guido of Elixir, I guess, is actually solving Advent of Code using Elixir and NX and live streaming it this year. So I'll be watching some of those videos as well to just hear from the creator some of the things that are happening there.
That's cool. There's a couple different people that are doing that on different platforms. So that'd be kind of an interesting watch to compare across them. As Python's growing, I hear, people in the core development of it are very interested in what other languages are doing. And that makes sense, for the language to kind of, I think it has to evolve in certain ways and improve. And so you can see where they're getting these ideas from.
Right. Yeah, I think it's really healthy that Python is learning from other languages and other languages are learning from Python, right? So there are, even in Elixir, we see things that are inspired by Python, although it's more of the Erlang and Ruby roots and things like this. But and likewise, if Python can kind of get some inspiration from these other languages, like the structural pattern matching comes from these functional languages. So I think that's just a win-win for all parts, right? We're kind of evolving towards something better.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show again. It's been really fun to talk to you, and I look forward to our conversations going forward now that you're doing Real Python full time.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. It's always fun to stop by here, and we'll keep in touch.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye. Don't forget, you can get simple cloud data connectivity to SaaS, big data, and NoSQL from Pandas, SQL Alchemy, Dash, and Pedal. Learn more at CData.com. I want to thank Geir Arne for coming on the show this week. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and look forward to talking to you soon.